sitting here with just a touch of apprehension of what's going to emerge during this 40 minutes. Being touched is certainly the experience. But it's quite an important experience. It tells us, it reminds us that we are actually human beings. We've probably all experienced our attention being caught by something or other for a moment. Perhaps it's something that's slightly out of place, something unusual. Perhaps it's something of great significance or beauty, or even something that's rather mysterious. Again, a very human experience. It's just a trivial example, perhaps. You might be walking past some shrub in the countryside and are suddenly hit by a wonderful scent. You might wonder where it comes from. But touched, being touched. It does seem that being touched is a very human experience. Perhaps not exclusively human, because there are other creatures that are also touched. But nevertheless, an essential aspect of our human nature. And our human nature being brought back to the heart of what we call economics is the real subject of this presentation. Being touched seems to help us to ensure our humanity does not really go far away. It's good actually having a title of a presentation and a sort of a theme as has just been outlined. But what follows, and what is the common practice here, is to just look the words up in a dictionary and explore how the phrase being touched is understood around the world. Well, certainly in English. And to start with, yes, we might expect that it describes those acts of kindness, kindness itself. But then you might, just for fun, look a little bit further. There's a thing called the Urban Dictionary, and this gives a few more senses of being touched. Not being quite right in the head is one. But it goes further and becomes quite extreme. In some communities, it can even mean being shot or stabbed. But luckily for us, we're going to be concentrating on the more gentle end of this vast spectrum of meaning. Being touched, it can certainly be a physical sensation. You know, the breath of the brush of air on the skin, or the touch of a feather, the lightest possible touch. But it can also be an emotional experience, as said before, being touched by the act of kindness, a parent caring for a child whilst walking them to the school. These moments can touch us. But even the emotional and the physical sense of touch can be quite extreme. Physically, we might be being hit by an object, or even worse. Emotionally, we might be shocked by the news, which will be quite a common experience today, or even traumatized through the experience of such events. A vast range, and yet we will start at least with the subtle end of the whole range of being touched. Let's go back to economics. At least the sort of economics that's been taught in universities for many decades now. That subject has evolved into rather an abstract subject, a mathematical subject, and a subject that's rather remote from human beings. Unfortunately, it still shapes the way we see the world. And this makes it more difficult to see the world as human beings, as families, living alongside other life forms, all breathing the same air, all warmed by the same sun. Looking at the world through the modern sense of economics really does not help our human appreciation of such simple things. What do we see in the world? We see a world full of problems. Often we call them economic problems. We've got the extremes of wealth alongside poverty. We have homelessness in what may be called the rich nations. We have the degradation of our big home, this planetary ecosystem. The list is actually quite long, but it's sufficient to draw out a common factor. All of these problems are human created. Now, we can take this actually to be good news. It suggests that maybe human beings have the solutions to such problems, or at least can start to move towards relieving some of the worst effects of the consequences of our actions. But if economics is shaping the world, the way we see the world, and economics has moved away from what it is to be a human being, how can we solve these problems without solving the very real problem about the way economics is today? How can we solve these problems without somehow recentering economics around what it is to be a human being? How can economics become, again, the study of relations between people and institutions in society with an aim for the prosperity and freedom for all? I'm going to just take up a few examples of being touched. And the first one, I'd like to introduce an assistant head teacher named Bex. That's B-E-X. She was introduced to the world a few days ago by the BBC. An assistant head in, I think it's Leeds, certainly in the UK, in rather a deprived part of the UK. And as with all teachers, it's quite a busy life. Each moment in the classroom, for example. A few years ago, she noticed that one of the pupils in her class was just slightly out of sorts. Now, in the busyness of a class, that sort of thing can easily be missed, but she held him back after the class and asked, "Did you sleep all right last night?" He was obviously, he had snapped at one of his mates. And he said, "No, miss, I'm always tired." It's a bit strange. How can a child always be tired? Well, she continued following this up. She stayed with that initial observation. And what emerged after a home visit was that the single mother was living in rather a poor place. The children had one bed bug-ridden cushion to share amongst them in order to sleep on the hard floor. And he pulled his shirt up to reveal bites from these bed bugs. By the way, this is in the UK, and I think it's one of the rich countries of the planet. She was shocked that this was under her nose. What later emerged is that there were a lot more in similar conditions. She was moved to actually respond to the situation, and did, and eventually set up a charity that tried to establish a bed for every head. And this is what she does in her spare time as an assistant head teacher in rather a demanding school. She roped her family and friends in to fund the first new bed, and has been delivering beds to needy homes ever since, and going further than that to provide those things that any decent home would expect. One of her observations was that this particular home had one light bulb that had to be moved from room to room in order to see. Don't forget, this is in one of the rich nations of the planet. So there's Bex. She was touched and moved and stayed with that she had been touched by, and followed it through and continues to follow it through. I believe that's on a podcast or something like that on the BBC. So that's a charity, that's Bex. And that really was quite something. She was astounded that this happened, that there was no facility for beds for heads. Another example is moving away from the realm of economics. That certainly does touch the realm of economics. But moving away just for a moment is to the sciences, those scientists that have blessed this world with the results of their endeavors. So Isaac Newton, you may remember him of Apple fame, but before the apple fell on his head, he was interested in looking at the moon through a homemade telescope. And he observed that there's a faint trace of color where the white turned to black. Now, many had observed this before and just dismissed it, but Newton is made of something different. He looked, he experimented, he stayed with the question of what this mysterious thing was. And out of that emerged his discovery that light, white light, could be split into colors with a prism. And even more, you could recombine those colors into white light with another prism. All of this was just magic to the world. And this has helped in many ways our understanding of this particular area of how the world works has benefited many since. He went on, but that's just one little example of being touched and staying with that sense of being touched and pursuing, discovering. There's more on this. Now, the second one we'll have, well, just one other little scientist called Albert Einstein. Well, little when he was 5 years old. He was touched by a pocket compass. His question, 5 years old, what is this hidden force? How can a hidden force move that mechanical object, the little needle inside the compass? Later on, he went on into slightly more complex questions, but that was one of the things that stayed with him, this question of how can there be a hidden force that's moving a physical object? Let's return to economics. The father of economics, so we call him, was Adam Smith. He was touched. For him, he could see human nature expressing itself as the all too familiar self-interest. And you could see that human beings wanted to better their lives. But what intrigued him was it was not just self-interest playing itself in a human being. There was also the capability of forming a moral judgment, not only of others, which might be quite easy to see, that person's wrong, but also on their own actions. This action that I'm about to follow in my own interest is somehow morally wrong. Now, that was quite something for Adam Smith. He was intrigued, and he followed up that moral judgment in his first great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it brought him fame. And he then went on to see how human beings work in society and what brings wealth to a nation. And the second big book that made him a superstar, in a sense, ever since, was The Wealth of Nations. Perhaps unfortunately for everyone ever since, it was a wealth of nations and this sense of self-interest that really laid the ground for what has become the study of economics. Self-interest. And Adam Smith might well be today criticized for having encouraged this sense of self-interest. It's a pity, perhaps, that we didn't take on both aspects of those things that intrigued him, this moral judgment as well. And this is what is so missing in the economics today. So it seems that one task that faces us as a human species is to reshape what we regard as the study of economics, reshape the way we see the world. I'll go on to another economist who was greatly touched and then ignored. His name was Henry George. Many economists say, well, he wasn't a real economist. He didn't have that sort of academic background. Anyway, he was touched. On a visit to New York, he saw this incredible wealth. But alongside that, abject poverty. And his question was really, how can human progress, which you would imagine would be for the betterment of human beings, always lie alongside such poverty? And his great book was Progress and Poverty. This question stayed with him for some time, and then he had his eureka moment. And for him, it was in the area of ownership, what we own. He expressed that in terms of owning the land. Land here standing for in a sense, the whole of Mother Nature, but ownership. What do we own? And that remains really one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves as we look out across the problems of the planet. And we'll see in the eastern side of Europe, what do we own is very much part of that situation. His book, Progress and Poverty, was a huge bestseller, and for some years after his death. But then As I suggested before, many economists didn't really like his approach, and it became rather ignored. Perhaps some people really did not like the implication that arose from his work, really questioning, what do I own? And what is the justification for that claim? How indeed do I compensate everyone else for not being able to own what I own? Anyway, after the crash of 2008, it was quite interesting to observe that people were starting to ask, well, have we got something wrong? Nobody saw it coming, of course. Have we got something wrong in the way we've got economics set up? And Henry George was one of the people that people turned back to, as well as Adam Smith and his first great book. And Henry George even appeared in the Financial Times, that paper of the City of London. And since then, every now and then, Henry George does come into the economic conversation. What a lot of men we've been talking about. Let's get some women on board. So the next one is Kate Raywith, well known to many of us through her book, Donut Economics. Her upbringing was in a world, as for many of us, of mass starvations, of famines, wars. One of the things she mentions was the mass death and maiming of the Bhopal disaster in India, which was the result of industrial carelessness or greed, we might say. But she was touched by the environmental destruction that's going on through our human activities. And her question, as any young person would be, is, well, how can I make a difference? For her, the obvious answer was economics. Let's go and study economics. And so she did at Oxford University. But she was shocked. And I suppose this is the touching moment. She was shocked when she realized that economics carefully skirted around all those things that she found to be valuable, like the environment and the well-being for all. It somehow treated some of these things as externalities, buried them under the carpet. And this is what happens. So she started working for the good of all through working in charities, working for the United Nations, really touched by the women in Zanzibar, of how they managed with microfinance whilst bringing up families to somehow feed their homes. And then she was touched by the real experience of her own motherhood with twins. And then she was ready to turn back to economics. And that's how the book emerged, really. Turning upside down, she described it as flipping economics upside down, so that it would be more aligned with the real sustainable goals of humanity. And so we have the book. And it's a brilliant combination of the sense of a social platform on which everyone has a possibility of thriving, whilst at the same time living within those ecological limits that our planet provides us with, if we want to live a sustainable existence with all other life forms. Her persistence with that question paid off. There's another economist, Mariana Mazzucato. She's now a professor at the University College London. She started off specializing in the area of innovation and public support or grants for a public investment. When the 2008 crash came along, she was really quite struck by some of the things she saw. the sadness of the austerity that ordinary people and families were being asked to endure. But this contrasted with the way entrepreneurs were being, or so-called entrepreneurs were being treated. In the UK, the civil servants were described as being enemies of enterprise, and entrepreneurs were being enticed into the east of London, where a new innovation centre was being set up. And she found this rather disconcerting and went back to explore how some of those huge companies, you know, the Apple, Google, Amazon, and the like, how they came to be, and looked at the sort of public grants and sweeteners they had at various times in their starting up phase. How much of that work was supported in that way, and yet somehow today, much of the profits from such enterprise rarely reaches the public purse again. But one of the most important areas of her book, which is called The Value of Everything, lies in that sense of value. This is what she, and what we take that word to mean. And she refers to the storyteller, a bit like Raywith's economics shaping the way we see the world. A story we're told, and it's a narrative for us to follow. The media today is a good example. We're being given a story. But of more significance is the economic narrative. Since the late 19th century, economics has treated value as meaning whatever price you can get for it. And that can be a good thing if you're able to form a monopoly. The price rises, so does the value, and even GDP. Well, perhaps good for some, but not for all. That book, The Value of Everything, it opens with the example of a drug company who invented a particular treatment for I think it's hepatitis, one of the hepatitis. And it was really quite a vital treatment for these patients that were in desperate needs, even close to dying. And it wasn't an expensive drug to make, but that company pushed the price up and to the point where the public health authorities could just manage to purchase it. This was seen to be the value of that drug. And in a sense, it was the value of that drug. But there was no moral consideration in that step taken. There was luckily a public outcry for that particular instance, but this is very common practice in the world today. Morals just do not play a part in the world of economics. So this is where economic thinking has reached, really. We've got one last one that Mariana Mazzucato mentioned was, or one of many, but one I'd just like to mention here was in the UK, the British Home Stores. British Home Stores that was founded back in 1928, was bought a long time later for £200 million. And later on still was sold for £1. In between that buying for 200 million and selling for £1, what was taken out of the company in terms of dividends and the like was round about 580 million over the years. After the sale of that business for £1, it was discovered there was a hole of about, I think it was 571 million in the pension funds for that company. The company was worth less, valueless. The 10,000 employees, their lives were damaged. And the communities they lived in, their families, the communities they lived in were also harmed. They were all somehow, the value was somehow extracted. But economics, it's not human. It's like a machine. It's like an algorithm. This is where the game is. Great shame, but this is where we are. My wife, knowing that I'm besotted with the subject of economics, drew my attention to a short book written by the Pope, Pope Francis. It's called Let Us Dream. She thought I'd be interested in this passage where he was discussing a couple of economists and the very subject of economics and the state it's in right now. So I did. Those two economists happened to be Kate Raywith and Mariano Mazzucato. And he was really impressed by them and was seeking advice from them, in a sense. So I read back a little bit to see how he got to this point. And there was a bit of a being touched moment here. There was one phrase in one sentence where something didn't quite fit, and it was unfinished thinking. Now, to me, the only point of thinking is to finish it. But here we had this sense of unfinished thinking. And what emerged, because he was extolling the virtues of unfinished thinking, what emerged from this is really what has been spoken about so far. So we had Adam Smith with his question that didn't quite have an answer, and that was his life work. We had Newton that couldn't quite make sense of those little colored fringes around the moon. We had Henry George, who couldn't quite see how such wealth coexisted with such poverty. Kate Raywith, who somehow couldn't see how economics could skirt around those things that she really valued. Mariano Mazzucato, who couldn't see how economics could be serving people, human beings, so badly. This unfinished thinking gives a couple of hints. One is the importance of not staying with snappy answers or sound bites. It suggests that when we are touched by something that intrigues us, it's worth just somehow holding it there, somewhere in the mind. It also suggests that it might be worth practicing holding, as Pope Francis described, contradictory truths or paradoxes in the mind until a greater sense of wholeness emerges. Actually, Francis suggested 3 steps. They won't be unfamiliar to us, but they can be helpful reminders. The first is just this being touched. The second is what he describes discernment, and the third is healing, but each needs a little more explanation. First, being touched. I've been speaking of this. But to open yourself up to being touched, the possibility, it takes a bit of courage. Being open to the joys and sufferings of others. But this is our humanity. We're not machines. We're not algorithms. It's possible. But it does seem sensible to practice this. I've been really enjoying walking to the office each day without anything plugged into the ears so that the birdsong can creep in. Just seeing the buds emerging from twigs and all the rest of it. dogs with their owners, all of these things can touch the heart, really. But also, the experience is one of healing, not as though I'm sort of walking along being ill, but just the mind somehow being soothed, caressed, refreshed, healed. Healing is not a bad word. For Pope Francis, discernment was really relates to that phrase, unfinished thinking. Somehow letting a dichotomy or paradox or a question rest there in the mind. We've had experience of having a problem, going to sleep and waking up the next morning with the answer. But for some of these examples, that waking up next morning was decades later. Perhaps the analogy of a fine wine or a fine cheese could be helpful. Something that needs to mature in the darkness. Practice, patience, and persistence seem to be helpful. Now, the healing, and as we look around the world, that is sorely needed today. Wherever possible, rather than sticking plasters, discovering those causes and somehow treating them. The bed for every head was a beautiful example. Generosity of human spirit meeting a real yet particular need. There's something magnificent about human beings, the possibility of that sort of generosity of spirit that is within all of us. With good fortune, we can be inspired by those moments of being touched to really face some of these difficult areas in the world, to heal those divisions in society. The mistreatment of our earthly home. And not just for us, but also for the sake of future generations. Several voices have spoken on these lines before. I'd just like to touch on, I think, three. One was a Quaker economist, Kenneth Boulding. He once said, anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. And many have spoken of that sense of economics is too important to be left to economists. This organization, the School of Philosophy and Economic Science, was also founded after a touching moment, a moment of being touched. The founder, Leon McLaren, young man during the Great Depression, where this country, indeed the world, was really suffering poverty, fear, desperate times. And yet, human beings are so capable. The possibilities of a human being are immense. So why couldn't people work? Why were machines lying idle? His father, Member of Parliament, was passionate about Henry George and had this book, Progress and Poverty. And this was quite an inspiration. But shortly after, Leon McLaren was sitting by a lake, as he describes it, pondering these things, and into the mind rose the sense of there is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as justice. This being so, they can be discovered. And being discovered, they can be taught. And a little later on, in 1937, this particular institution was started. It was started with the teachings of Henry George, which was really popular at that point in time. Then World War II came along, and people lost interest in that. They all had good work after the war, rebuilding society. But what was really interesting to people was philosophy. And that really took off. So the school, this organization, offers courses in practical philosophy and in economics with justice. Who comes to these? Well, again, the feeling here is it's a matter of being touched. You might be touched by a moment of complete mystery. What am I? Who am I? What is this world? It might just lead you on to the question of philosophy. You might be touched by the injustices in the world, the sense of there must be a better way. That could just lead you on to economics with justice. And all being well, with that persistence, there could just be a change in the way that we see the world. I'm conscious that we're probably running up against the time. But I would encourage anyone who feels touched by these great questions of life, who am I, or what am I? And what is this world in front of me, and how may justice prevail? Come along. You will find that there are like-minded people, and when like-minded people come together and join together, the conversations can be quite uplifting and most rewarding.